Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we are going to be talking about Dreadshade and doing a deep dive on it in this video. So, I'll be honest, a lot of times whenever I'm perusing Twitch and watching people randomly, or I'm talking to people on the Discord, or assisting other people with build help, one of the number one things I see all the time, specifically for all you Necromancer Minion lovers out there, is the lack of Dreadshade in all of your builds. And I'll be honest, whenever I see one without Dreadshade, it makes me cry because it is probably one of the strongest skills in the entire game still. Even with it being power crept by certain things, it still packs a wallop. It is one of the best buff skills / curse skills to ever exist in the history of Last Epoch, and it's definitely mandatory on most minion builds. Recently, there's been a little bit of a change up in the meta where there are some specific, very tailored builds that don't utilize Dreadshade as a minion build, but for the most part, you're utilizing Dreadshade, and that's for a myriad of reasons. Now, before we get into that, if you haven't already, I would heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel, as that is the best way of supporting me currently and also showing me that you want more content specifically like this, as the more support these kind of videos get, the more that I can make and of course do more skill deep dives on, so you guys can have a little bit more assistance when you're making your own builds. So to start off, let's talk about what Dreadshade does at a base. So it is very unassuming in the beginning. It has a decent mana cost, a decent cast speed. It actually gains mana efficiency per point of intelligence you have, which is really strong as you're usually intelligence stacking on mini builds. But the main effect is whenever we apply it to a minion, its health is drained by 3% of its max health per second for each second the shade has been active on it. So eventually it will make it so that the minion goes to 1 health and then anything will kill it. But it will also give the minions in the AoE plus 10 necrotic flat damage, and their spells and attacks will have 50% increased necrotic damage. Now, this is very unassuming at first, but there's a lot of nodes inside Dreadshade that pump up this buff to the absolute moon, and there's a lot of different ways of abusing Dreadshade currently in the current Last Epoch patch. So the vanilla version of Dreadshade is not used very often. That is because the drain that it has associated with it will lead to eventual minion death, as it keeps your minions at 1 HP, and then of course any kind of damage will kill it afterwards, whether that be your own damage or the enemy's damage. Now, there are a few ways of getting around this problem, which we'll be talking about when we bring up 3 different examples of builds that utilize Dreadshade in completely different ways to achieve completely wildly different goals. So let's talk about that, shall we? The first build that we're going to be utilizing as an example is going to be Spectres Necromancer. The idea is we utilize the skeleton transplant mana loop, where we create a very large amount of Blood Spectres, which will end up making it into a more minion zoo playstyle, your vanilla kind of playstyle that you would think of whenever you're playing a minion build, lots of little bodies running around. And the way that we utilize Dreadshade in this is probably the most generic way of utilizing Dreadshade. So the first thing that we do is we utilize Lone Watcher. Lone Watcher turns off the degen of Dreadshade, but makes it so that you can only ever have 1 Dreadshade up at a time. But if you're playing it to buff your minions, usually this downside doesn't really matter, and it does make it so the duration of the original duration of Dreadshade also increases as well, up to 40 seconds. This is very nice for generic playing in the monoliths and stuff like that, so you don't have to focus on recasting it constantly, and it's very nice. And you can also increase the area of the Dreadshade itself so that it hits more of your minions at once, as your minions do need to be within the area. Now, this is mainly good for melee minions, or if all of your minions are ranged. If you have a mixture of ranged and melee minions, this mode isn't very good, as you would require a very large amount of AoE to make Dreadshade hit everything. So it would be a better idea to use a different mode if you have a mixture of melee and ranged minions. Another thing that we abuse in this specific setup is the ailment chance granted by the node that converts the flat damage on Dreadshade into poison chance. This is a very large amount of poison chance for your minions and allows you to play a minion poison build alongside with Aura of Decay and some other neat tricks, but generally having access to all that poison chance pushes your ailments to the moon, as you can get as much ailment chance as possible, especially when you're playing a generic ailment setup like I'm doing in the footage here. The next example that we're going to be talking about is a solo minion build. Now, Dreadshade is essentially the propagator of every single solo minion build. The idea is we utilize one really big minion and we try to stack it Voltron style by stacking as many buffs on it as humanly possible. The reason for this is currently, in the current state of Last Epoch, Dreadshade only targets minions that are nearby your cursor. So if you mess up, you can actually end up casting Dreadshade on a different minion other than the big minion that you want. If it wasn't the case, then we could run supporting minions on top of these kind of builds. But right now, as it currently stands, without any way of changing Dreadshade's behavior, it is very annoying to cast Dreadshade on a big target. And that is because of the node Egoism. Egoism gives Dreadshade a very long cooldown, but it does make it so that the minion auto-crits. The reason why this node is so insanely strong for solo minion builds specifically, for the most part, is minion base crit is very hard to come by. Minion crit is very hard to come by. There are only very specific minions that crit very easily, and this makes it so that this node is very priceless. It's very important. This makes it so your A-bomb actually does damage. Your bone golems can actually reach crit cap. If you don't have this, you actually can't crit cap very easily with bone golems and A-bombs, which would make them significantly worse than they currently are. So Egoism is the center of all of these builds. Very important for their functionality as the Voltron setup. Now, another node we also are abusing because of this is also All for One. We do not provide aura buffs for anyone, but it does make it so that Dreadshade gives them 40% more damage. This helps a lot, as it makes it so that, we want all those stacking modifiers applying with each other, which will lead to us doing a very large amount of damage. Now, this node that we're going to be talking about next, Grim Fate, it's actually a node that we utilize on a bunch of different builds. It's just a generic 60% more damage in a very large amount of area. We use this on almost every single Dreadshade setup, mainly because it just gives you a global 60% more damage, and this will apply to the Voltron playstyle for the solo minion, and also just be a generic buff for the rest of our minions, making Dreadshade a very, very large buff. This node specifically makes it so that Dreadshade is way more efficient in being one of your slots instead of having the 5th minion, because instead of having the 5th minion, you would be much more inclined to run Dreadshade with Grim Fate, as that would give you 60% more damage on top of all of its other benefits, which makes Dreadshade way more superior than trying to shove in a 5th minion. The last example for Dreadshade today is going to be Bleed, Rip Blood Minion Abusing Necromancer. So the concept that this build follows is we utilize Bone Curse to curse our enemies, and then we pop it with a way of hitting our minions, in this case Marrow Shards, and then it causes a very large amount of Rip Bloods in a very quick succession, and we apply our own bleeds with our own damage to the enemy. Simply, our minions are there as livestock, we hit them, it causes a bunch of triggers for us for a very large amount of bleeds. That's the main purpose of our minions here. Now, Dreadshade actually has a very interesting use case for builds like this, where you're playing as a Necromancer, but you're also trying to do damage. That is because of Symbiotic Apparition and Enemy of My Enemy. Now, Enemy of My Enemy makes it so that, I believe, if I'm not mistaken here real quick, yes, Enemy of My Enemy makes it so that you can attach Dreadshade to enemies. This is very strong, as it allows you to place it as kind of like a pseudo curse on enemies, and minions can move near the enemy, and as they're in that AoE, you can actually get buffed by them. This can also apply to you thanks to Symbiotic Apparition, which makes it so that Dreadshade's buffs can also apply to you. So you get the 60% more damage, you get the poison chance, you get the flat damage, you get everything in Dreadshade's tree that's applied to you for the most part, as long as it didn't specify minions, and that gives us a very large amount of 60% more damage, as well as a bunch of cast speed and a bunch of other nice modifiers. That allows this kind of build to function properly on a non-lich, non-warlock setup, and that's why Dreadshade actually can compete with the other S tier skills in like Acolyte in general, like Death Seal and stuff like that, mainly because of this massive 60% more modifier, specifically with its interaction of enemy of my enemies and flesh harvest. So flesh harvest, the way it works is it makes it so that you actually gain more buff effect for Dreadshade based on minions missing health. So if I apply it to a minion with a very low amount of health, I get more damage, more flat damage, more ailment chance. Every single modifier inside Dreadshade gets multiplied by this buff effect. And this can stack very, very high. Not only is this very strong on like the Voltron setups, if your A-bomb takes a little bit of damage, it will make it so that A-bomb hits even harder, by the way. Just letting you know that. You can make it hit really hard. It also works with enemy of my enemies. So if we apply Dreadshade to an enemy and their health goes down, if they're like at 50% health, we actually get 50% Dreadshade buff effect, which means that 60% more damage becomes 90% more damage, up to like a massive 120% more damage when the enemy is close to dead. And that allows us to deal more damage the lower health the enemy is, and allows us to combat the current state of boss DR a little bit as well on most minion builds. And it's a very useful tool in the Necromancer toolkit. So I talked about the main use cases for Dreadshade. Those are the most important use cases for it. But we are going to hop into the planner and talk about the more niche cases for it. So let's talk about some specific nodes. So the first one we're going to be talking about is Final Grasp. This makes it so you can cast Sacrifice multiple times whenever the minion that is affected by Dreadshade dies. So the main way of abusing this node right now is to have a bunch of minions, apply a bunch of Dreadshades to your minions, and then you get a bunch of free sacrifice casts currently, and that will blow up everything. Currently, the best way of doing this is to utilize the node inside Bone Curse, which makes it so that you get a bunch of minions whenever you cast it, and you can get a very large amount of minions very quickly, cast up to like 6 Dreadshades, pop them all, and it's just very fun to watch. It's a lot of damage, very fun. One of the main ways of utilizing this node. Another node that we utilize that's not used very often is the Doomed Wrath. This node here gives your Abomination up to like, I think currently 45% more damage. If you really want to go have some fun and punch some Orobuses and really have some fun, you can make a really big A-bomb with a lot of minions inside of it and run Doomed Wrath, but this does require you to grab Pernicious Pact. This makes it so there's no health decay, but you are applying an everlasting poison each second, so we get a poison. Eventually they stack, and eventually the minion dies because of the poisons. So that is the downside of running Doomed Wrath, but it is for large effect. Another node that we utilize is Infernal Dread. This refreshes Infernal Shade's duration on cast. This is very strong for a different myriad of reasons for Infernal Shade. If you know about Infernal Shade, you can make Infernal Shades that stick on the ground and you can place them to your limit. That will refresh those durations of those Infernal Shades on the ground. It will refresh shortened durations of Infernal Shades. So if you use like Sacrifice to reduce the duration of Infernal Shade, you can pop it much quicker. There's a lot of different reasons to utilize Infernal Dread. That's really great. Then we also have access to Beyond Death. Beyond Death, the way this works is it summons a new zombie from its corpse, from the minion that died. There's a few different ways of utilizing this, but currently we utilize it to create a new big zombie whenever a zombie dies, and that will make it so that we can pop it constantly. So we have one really big zombie or up to 2 really big zombies, and we keep popping them constantly, and that can lead to very large explosions thanks to like chaos bolts and stuff like that. It actually ended up becoming one of the best leveling setups for Necromancer in general. So Beyond Death is definitely a node that is very strong currently. You do have a node that can give you armor per vitality. This is actually really good because this works also as well with the buff effect. So you can actually get a very large amount of flat armor for just building vitality. So if you are a vitality stacking Necromancer, this actually helps you a lot. Gives you a lot of free flat armor, which you can multiply, of course. Another node that not many people utilize, but it does exist and it's very interesting, is Doombrand. So the way Doombrand works is we apply it to minions. They take extra damage over time from the Doombrand, and this Doombrand will keep ticking their life as long as they're within the area of Dreadshade, right? It drains the health of other minions and it applies them Doombrand. Now, when they die, they create an explosion. Now, this explosion is your ability. You can actually do damage with it. It's a small little explosion. It has a decent damage effectiveness and has a massive 200% more damage here. But the idea is we apply Dreadshade, minions die, they cause explosions. You can crit with them. You can do damage with them. They're very interesting. They're very hard to play with currently. It's not like easy anymore, mainly because they nerfed the node inside volatile zombies. You can't get as many of those little corpse parasites anymore, so you can't make as many Doom brands happen off as quickly. But Doom brands are very interesting in general. This is a very interesting way of utilizing it. Not many people utilize it, but it's very good. Now, with all that being said, this has been Dread. If you haven't already, I'd heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more stuff like this. Bye, guys.